Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Eric Smith here, contributor on 5 Reasons Sports, also co-host of Scouting the Fins with Hassan Patel and Eric Wiedeke on the 5 Reason YouTube, and also the 3 yards per carry feed. We're going to do something a little different for the channel today and bring on a guest. Today's guest is someone who's flipping the fantasy world on its head. He's the founder and mastermind behind UltraGM, the most immersive GM style fantasy football platform out there. If you've ever screamed at your TV thinking you could run your team better than the real GM, this guy built a tool to prove it. Please welcome to the channel the architect of UltraGM, Evan Goldenberg.
Hey, Eric.
How you doing,
Thanks for
Evan?
Good. Everything's good. How about you?
Doing well. So, we're going to hop right into this. The folks that are just hearing about UltraGM for the first time, what exactly is it and how does it flip the script on traditional fantasy football?
So UltraGM is a completely new kind of fantasy football. The concept is basically to put you into the role of the GM of your favorite team. For most of us here, it's going to be the Dolphins. How many times have you said to yourself, what the hell is Greer doing? What is Mueller doing? What is Ireland doing? I could do the job better than these guys do it. I think we've all said that probably countless times. And UltraGM is kind of an opportunity to prove that. So what happens is you come in, you buy your team, the Dolphins in this case, you acquire the Dolphins roster as of the start of the league year. So that's the start of free agency. And then you build that team the way you want to build it. You draft the players you wanted to draft. You pursue the free agents you wanted the Dolphins to pursue and sign. You make the trades you think they should make. And then as you develop that roster, you compete fantasy football style throughout the season based upon, the performance of the players on your roster and what they do on the field. But one of the differences is that instead of it just being skill positions and a defense, it's a full 53-man roster plus a practice squad. You have scoring for all positions except for long snappers. I couldn't figure out how to score a long snapper, but even punters get scored, very, very small amount. So you have scoring for all positions. So all of those aspects that, as you know, are critically important to the success or failure of a football team, things like the offensive line that are completely excluded really from traditional fantasy football, have the same importance here in UltraGM that they have in the real world. And when you're drafting, you want to draft and you want to take those priorities into account and say, hey, the offensive line's important, defensive line's important. These are, in the same way that they're important in real football, they're important in UltraGM because our scoring is scaled to the relative values of the positions, or at least I should say the relative value as the NFL perceives it. So, quarterback, I think everyone agrees that quarterback is your most important position on the field. In regular fantasy football, quarterbacks are almost kind of an afterthought, and it's running backs that are those top picks typically. But in UltraGM, on average, quarterbacks will score, 2+ times more than any other position because the position just is that important. And then it's followed by kind of those other, what people often refer to as the premium positions, your left tackles, your edge rushers, your cornerbacks. And then, in the lesser grade, at least as the NFL perceives it, overall, you have positions like safety and linebacker that are, generally perceived to be somewhat less important. But the best players at those positions are still going to score well and are going to be very important parts of your roster.
That's awesome. That, definitely sounds like it is something that should appeal more to the, the football purists, the guys that really enjoy not just watching the ball, but enjoy the game overall. So let me ask you, what inspired you to create UltraGM and how has that vision evolved over time to where we are now?
So, I think I was inspired. I've played regular fantasy football for 20 years plus, in the same league with friends and family. And I've enjoyed the camaraderie of it and just, kind of staying in and having this little bit of competition going on. But it always kind of left me feeling a little bit flat and a little bit superficial. It didn't really match with what I think is interesting and exciting and important about football. Isn't really captured in your typical fantasy football. Mm-hmm. So I was one of these guys that have said plenty of times I could do, what is Greer doing? What's Ireland doing? What's Mueller doing? What are these guys doing? And thought, hey, there should be something that kind of feeds that up, the desire, which to me is what the real fantasy and fantasy football is. Like, the fantasy is to be the GM of the Dolphins. And so this tries to put the user in that role, and actually lets you even compete against the existing GM of your team. So one of the unique features of this product of UltraGM is that your team, you have your one team, but you play simultaneously in two different leagues. One of those leagues is a 32-team league, completely mirrors the NFL. You play the same schedule as the real NFL. And that's the league where all your transactions take place. That's where you draft, where you trade, where you compete for free agents, etc. The other league is a single team league. In our case, it's the Dolphins. So it's a Dolphins league. One of the teams in that league is what I'll call the Chris Greer Dolphins. And so you'll see each week how that team is performing and how they're scoring. And then you'll have your own score. And then you'll also be competing against 12 other guys just like us who also think that they can manage the Dolphins better than anyone else. And we'll each have, our own visions of how the team should be built, our own preferences among players to be drafted and signed. And so, the teams will have some similarity because they'll be based on the core of the Dolphins, but there will be those differences, and it's those differences that will matter. So if you have friends and family who are also Dolphins fans, hardcore, fans that are into this kind of stuff, you can compete against each other in that Dolphins league to see essentially who can take those same starting raw materials, that same basic starting roster, and build the best scoring or best roster out of it.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I mean, I know that when I was growing up, I always loved the Madden franchise mode. Loved the NFL head coach game. I think it was back in, I don't know, probably 2010s time frame where it was just the head coach part of it. Love that game.
Right.
Sounds like a lot of crossover here with UltraGM to the stuff that we had in there. So let's put this.
And so one of the things about Madden, there's definitely those crossovers because there's that same notion of taking over, starting with the team that you choose. It's a little different in that, instead of it playing out in a simulation, of course, it plays out on the field on Sundays. And so there's, I think, this connection between your UltraGM team and your Dolphin fandom that are kind of connected because, a certain portion of your team are still going to be Dolphin players. You've still got that connection. You're playing that same schedule. So, when your buddy who's a Bills fan is you're playing against him in the 32-team league and the Dolphins are playing the Bills, you guys are also going head-to-head there. So, I think Madden – I know so many people, and I know it was the case with my son, as hard as I tried to teach him when he was little about football, like it's tough. It's a tough thing to explain, but so many people, I think, really learned football through Madden. And part of that, I think, is just the opportunity to kind of have it in your hands and do it. And in that same way, I think that UltraGM will sort of provide a richer or enhanced just football knowledge base. The difference between hearing about these moves and managing the salary cap and doing it yourself, I think will create an additional layer of kind of complexity, but also understanding of what really are those factors that are in play when you're sitting there on the clock in a draft and you're the one making the decision of who to take, or when you're looking at free agents and you're trying to evaluate, not only the player, but the contract that's going to come along with him.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I mean, me going away from Madden had a lot to do with it, very much just being, in the fantasy world. Like you play the franchise mode there, but you're, playing against a computer for the most part. It's not, you don't have rooting interests outside of your game or your Madden leagues. So I think this really gets the crossover there that, managing an entire team, but it also gives you rooting interest in other games across the league as well. Because as you build out your team, you're going to have, mainly Miami Dolphins if that's the team that you choose to use, but you're obviously not going to, bring in the same players in free agency. You're not going to release the same players. So you're going to have, interest across the league with the other games. So let's say that I sign up today, right? I think you said that the team looks like exactly as it would look on the opening of the league year, so pre-free agency, pre-draft. What are the next steps after somebody signs up and creates a team in UltraGM?
Okay, well let's go to that the startup process. If you can share the screen, I'll show you. So here's a screen. This isn't the first screen you'll see. That's sort of the first screen you'll see is an introduction, and you'd go in and you'd create an account up here in the upper right. This is my screen. I have, multiple teams in a couple of different leagues, of course. And so you'll see at the top, there's a choice to create or join private leagues. That's if you have a group of people that you want to play with together. And you can do that for both the 32-team league or the 14-team league. Now, the 14-team league is the Dolphin-specific league in our case. That's probably the one that's more viable for most people for a private league. It's going to be tough to put together fans of 32 different teams, but most of us probably have a good number of other Dolphin fans that you might want to play with. And so you could create or join a private league. Or you can do a public league. And in the public league, what you do is you'd go into this bottom section. You'll see there's the various team logos. All the teams currently are priced at $30. That's for the season, and that's for both leagues that your team will be involved in. And then you would, select the Dolphins. You'd go to next. It will show you the leagues that you're being placed into. And if you're good with the leagues that you're being placed into, you can just, move ahead and go to next. Or there's a find your friend mechanism where you can put a friend's name or a friend's email in there. And if you want to play in the same league with them, you can find their league. And if there's a space for your team in that league, you can join that one instead of one of the ones that you would otherwise be joining. And then you go to, you choose to the next screen. You get the payment details. Here's where you would have a promo code to insert. In this case, the one you want to do is Smith25, and you'd put that in. You'd add, the other payment information, and that will give you $5 off. So it will cost you $25 instead of $30 for the season. Which I know that there are other ways of playing fantasy football for free, but not this way. There's nowhere else that you can get this level of engagement and this kind of experience. And although, it's not nothing, $25 is, I think, less than you can buy a Dolphins t-shirt on MiamiDolphins.com. It's probably 1.5 beers in the stadium if you go to a game. I mean, in the scheme of things, it's not all that much. I think it's a very, very reasonable price for, I think, the degree of engagement that the kind of hardcore fans that I think will be interested in this will feel from it and enjoy from it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So now we have the team set up. What type of decisions each week are UltraGM GMs going to make, from week to week?
So from week to week, let me take you into a manage roster screen. Now this is showing a Dolphins lineup. This is essentially the players that were, again, there at the beginning of the league year. Things are redded out because this is where you would set your active roster, but because the season hasn't started yet, it's not turned on to make those changes. But for example, you'll see when you set your roster each week, you have a full 53-man roster plus a practice squad, but you do set an active roster. And the active roster is essentially, approximates the number of players at each position that are reasonably likely to see the field. And so, for example, it's one quarterback you make active, 3 running backs, 5 receivers, 2 tight ends, 7 offensive linemen, 12 front 7 defenders, 7 secondary players, a kicker, a punter, kick returner, and a punt returner. So you do make a decision each week about who to keep, who should be active. You'll see on here as part of that process, if you're a hardcore Dolphin fan, you probably know the Dolphins roster backwards and forward. You pretty much know the depth chart and who's likely to play. But you may have some players on your UltraGM Dolphins team that are on other teams, and you may not be as familiar with where they are in the depth chart. So for those players, you'll see that there is depth, and it shows, Tua as QB1, Taj Washington is, wide receiver 9, Tanner Connor is tight end 5. So you'll have a guideline to see what is the likelihood of this guy playing, even if he's a player that you don't necessarily have the same familiarity with that you would have with your Dolphin players. And then from here on this screen, your options are to either make active, to bench, or during the season to demote to the practice squad. Those are sort of the roster management options that you'll have on kind of a week-to-week basis. Just switch this. So up here in the left-hand corner, you'll see that there's a series of different leagues. You can toggle between the various leagues you're in. I'm going to just switch this to a league that played last year through our test season. And this was the Cleveland Clowns, which, I think was an appropriate name for the team. And there you can see, for example, if you go to propose trade, if they wanted to trade with the Minnesota team from last year's version, you could click on the players that you want to trade. You'll see that it will also show things like cap hit, and then you'll also see that you have the set of draft picks available here that you can choose from to also trade. So in the UltraGM draft, you can move up and down the draft board. You'll start where the Dolphins picked. That's kind of the default slot, but you can move up and down if there's a player you want to get or if you want to accumulate additional picks.
Okay, so I think, maybe I kind of jumped ahead there with the question on the week-to-week stuff, because I think we need to, talk about the offseason stuff as well. We're starting with the original league year Dolphins. How does free agency work, as far as both the timing of, when you would handle free agency as a GM of a team in UltraGM, as well as just the mechanics of it?
Right. So free agency will start in UltraGM when the league locks. And we have coming up, July 1st is sort of a deadline of sorts. The leagues that lock by July 1st will have the first draft, which will be July 12th. And those teams will also have the start of their free agency. So the way UltraGM free agency works is that a player becomes a free agent in UltraGM when they actually sign their new NFL contract. And when they sign that new contract in real life, the player and the contract become available for bidding. So it's essentially a package deal. So you'll have to look at the player and not only evaluate the player as a player, but also the contract that they're signing. So, for example, in last year, I think a lot of us were pretty sad to see Christian Wilkins go. Would have loved to have kept him. But I think for a lot of us, when we saw the deal that he did ultimately sign with the Raiders, it was like, yeah, that's pretty rich. That might be more than I'm willing to spend. So you have to make that kind of calculation, and then you would bid. You have sort of a pool of fake money with which to bid on free agents. And when you get the free agent, you get the player and the contract, and it all sits against your salary cap, which is the real NFL salary cap. So one of the team management factors that you've got to consider is the salary cap. And we've tried to make that, it's the real NFL salary cap with real NFL salaries, but, we've tried to make that as simple as possible to manage. So it's kind of just the main information that you need. And we do have a cap calculator that will be coming out shortly in time for this season that will do all the math for you. You won't have to pull out a spreadsheet or a calculator or anything like that. You'll put in the transaction that you're interested in, and it will tell you the cap consequences of that deal, and then you decide whether you want to proceed with it or not.
Okay. And then, so another question I had is just in traditional fantasy football, you have owners of teams that they come and they go. Sometimes you end up with, leagues that either aren't full or you have a team that's not represented by an actual person. How does UltraGM handle those obstacles?
So if there are, if a league doesn't have an owner for a particular team, it gets substituted in what we call a CPU team, which is the actual team. So when I mentioned before the Chris Greer Dolphins, which is, whoever the Dolphins play that week is who that team is playing and is getting scored. That's what happens here. So in terms of actual week-to-week gameplay, it's really pretty seamless. There's no difference. You still have an opponent. It's still an opponent with real players and a real team. You still have that barometer to see how you're doing. So having those gaps doesn't really affect gameplay. We do want to have as many real users as possible and to fill out leagues with as many, because you can only trade with real team, with human-owned tems. So we don't do trade simulations. We don't have, we're not using AI or anything to decide on trades. I found when I've done that kind of thing, whether in Madden or in mock draft simulators, I just don't think there's much realism typically in how those trades are determined. So for a trade, we require an actual human buyer and an actual human seller, coming to terms on an arm's length agreement. And so you want to be in a league, and we want to have as many human users as possible, so you have as many different people to trade with as possible.
Makes sense. All right, so let's get to kind of the nuts and bolts of it here. The scoring, right? We know that real fantasy football uses the box score numbers, and that's how those scores are generated. How does the scoring work in UltraGM, especially when you're working with positions that don't show up in the box score, like the offensive line?
So it's a little bit more sophisticated than typical fantasy, but we didn't want to make it too complicated where we didn't have to. So for your typical skill position players, regular fantasy football is pretty much all pure production based. It's just yards and touchdowns, essentially. There's not really an efficiency component. And I felt like that was kind of a weakness in traditional fantasy football. So we've kept it relatively simple, but we've added an efficiency component. So for quarterbacks, the formula essentially devolves around passing yards during the game and passer rating during the game. So the passing yards is kind of the measure of both production. The passer rating is the efficiency measure, and also takes into account things like touchdowns and interceptions and yards per attempt and all of that. So those two things are essentially fused together, and that's what drives quarterback scoring. For running backs, it's rushing yards per game and yards per carry. Running backs, of course, also get credit for receiving yards. For receiving, it's receiving yards per game and yards per target. So yards per target is kind of the efficiency measure. So for the skill position players, that's how it works. Obviously, we had to get a little more creative with some positions, including, as you said, offensive line. And what we're doing with offensive line is we are using Sports Info Solutions total points metric. And what SIS does is they take the EPA on each play, they review the film, and they divvy up credit and blame for that play, for that EPA, among the players on the field. And that includes offensive linemen. And so we're using their blocking points metric for both run blocking and pass blocking to determine the contribution of the offensive lineman. And what that does, the reason I felt like that was better than some of the other options, one is that it includes run blocking, which there are some decent stats out there, I think, for pass blocking, sacks allowed, hurries allowed, things like that. But there's nothing for run blocking, really. But the blocking points metric that SIS has that component of not just doing your job well, but also a component of impact. So, if a guy has a great block on the backside of the play that really doesn't affect much, he's not going to get as many points as he's going to have for a great block on the front side that springs the 50-yard touchdown.
Right.
So no metric is perfect, but I think that was the best one that was out there. And, like I said, I think it's not real football if we're not including offensive line and, performance. It's just such a critical part of the game. And so I don't know if it's perfect scoring, but I think it's the best thing out there. And I think it actually does hold up pretty well when you look at the lists of the top scoring players on the offensive line each year. It matches pretty well with what one would expect. There's a couple of surprises sprinkled in from time to time, but for the most part, the players that we all think are the best players do score the best. And like I said, in some cases that the offensive linemen aren't afterthoughts. Offensive tackles are the second or third highest scoring position in UltraGM. So, so they're given, I think the credit for the importance and impact that they have.
Yeah, no, I like that answer a lot. I mean, like you said, no scoring system is perfect, but definitely like the way that UltraGM is including the offensive line and making sure that they have an impact on the way these games are scored and played.
I just want to, before we move on from the scoring. So
yeah,
on defense, we use, almost all of the major metrics for defensive players: tackles, assists, sacks, hurries, quarterback hits, fumbles forced, fumble recoveries, interceptions. I mean, all of those things are part of the formula. We do also use part of this SIS points metric for some of the defensive positions. So, for example, I think a nose tackle who is your classic clog up the line, tie up blockers, but isn't going to make a lot of tackles themselves, isn't going to really fill out a stat sheet. Those players would be undervalued if we weren't also considering something else that takes into account that contribution. So we're using part of the run defense SIS points metric is part of the equation for defensive tackles and defensive ends. And then in the secondary, the other place where I think there's kind of a major gap between traditional statistics is kind of your classic shutdown corner. The guy who doesn't get tested much, he's just not going to typically put up the kind of box score stats that really reflect his true value. And so we're using part of SIS's coverage points metric as a component, as a supplement to kind of your regular box score scoring for defensive backs.
Yeah, I love that. So season to season, right? Is UltraGM more of like the Dynasty type league where you keep your roster and you carry it over from year to year, or when the new league year starts, do you restart with whatever team you're choosing? Do you restart with their roster?
So it's designed to be primarily Dynasty and to carry over from season to season. That's how I'd like to see people do it, because I think if you're doing the GM job, you need to be doing it looking ahead more than just 1 year. Mm-hmm. That being said, I am anticipating that there may be some people who find out after year one, like, gee, that wasn't as easy as I thought it was, and I'm not so much in love with the team that I've created. So there is an ability only in the offseason to reset your roster and start over from scratch if you want to. You'd stay in the same league. We wouldn't have to, otherwise fill the league or whatever, but you would have the ability to hit the reset button, so to speak, and start over from scratch.
All right, and that's great because, like you said, this is a brand new concept, and some people are going to think that they're better than what they what they really are. They're going to find out what kind of GM they are compared to
Right.
Chris
I mean,
Greer, and it's good to be able to have that opportunity to reset that
right.
Chris Greer doesn't have. So long term, what's your ultimate goal with Ultra GM? Do you have plans to expand to other sports, or are there additional features that aren't in yet that you're brainstorming on now?
There are both. There are some plans. There, I need to, we need to get our footing and be, established. I think with football, and first things first is the NFL product. I do envision expanding to other sports into the future. I'm not myself much of a soccer guy, but I'm kind of fascinated by both the business of soccer, which is very different from the NFL, but it's also an important part of the game, and in the same way that we're using the salary cap, that soccer business, and it's also just it's a massive international market that I would love to take over and conquer. But that's getting way out ahead. But also basketball, baseball are things that I'm thinking about adapting the concept to. Each league, each sport, and each league is different in the way they operate, and so things would need to be done different for each one. But there's, I think, still a basic core concept of putting you in the role of the manager of your team and letting you build the team and play it out fantasy style that's adaptable across multiple sports. So there's that. And then in terms of functionality in the site, there definitely are some anticipated future enhancements. And you kind of, when you start something like this, you have to have your kind of minimum viable product. I probably went a little bit overboard on the minimums here. I remember, when I was thinking it out and planning it out and thinking about the practice squad, I was kind of like, do I really, do I need to have a practice squad? Is that like something that for, version 1 of this is really essential? And it probably isn't, but I wanted to do it anyhow. And I did so because, I think when you're actually doing this, the practice squad is, your best avenue for working up and solidifying the bottom of your roster. Your best opportunities, especially in season, for shoring up a position where there's a weakness, or if you have injuries during the season, that's the best way and best place to find your replacements. And so, we included the practice squad, even though, that might have been a level of detail that wasn't really necessary for version 1. And I'll say for the practice squad, the rules are a little bit different than in the real NFL. It's 90% the same, but the NFL has some arcane rules as to who can be on a practice squad, how many weeks they have to be on an active roster after you poach them from another team. We've kind of smoothed all that stuff out, so anyone can be put on the practice squad. But when you do it, you are essentially first waiving the player, taking whatever dead cap hit there might be for that player, and then re-signing them to this practice squad deal. So it's not super viable for the most part for players who have, big dead money hits sitting on their contracts. There's, vested veterans who with big contracts aren't really going to make sense for the practice squad, but technically you could do it. And then we got rid of the idea that, in order to, if you poach a player off another practice squad, you have to have them on your active roster for a certain period of time. Just figuring, look, if you want to protect the player and not have him poached back, then you've got to put him on your active roster. And if you have him on your practice squad, then it's fair game for someone else to go and steal him. So it'll be a little bit Wild West, a little bit more so maybe than the real NFL, but I think that actually will be kind of a fun part of in-season play of, stealing people off of other people's practice squads. So,
yeah, I know I definitely appreciate the detail that you've put into this, trying to make it as close to the real activities that a GM would have to manage. So as we, kind of wrap up here, are there any, features or anything about Ultra GM that we haven't touched on that you want to share with the listeners?
I think we've touched on, most of the main core elements. I guess I'd, put out for anyone if there are any questions, coming out of this, you can reach me by email at Evan, EVAN at ultragm.com. And, happy to answer any questions or work through any issues if anyone has concerns about things. I think we showed at the beginning when you sign up, the teams it's $30 for the season. It's a $25 if you use Eric's Smith 25 promo code. We don't operate prizes through the league. So league members will be able to get together and decide on a pool if they want to do that and they want to have some, a little bit of some stakes, monetary stakes. That's not something that I was prepared to handle for now, because if we were to get involved in handling prize money, we then subject ourselves to 50 different states' gaming laws and all sorts of other craziness that, frankly, I'm just not ready for. For now, I want people to get on, enjoy the product. We'll enhance it as we go, because, one of the great things about this sort of project is that it is infinitely tweakable and improvable. And I'm sure as we go through it, we will learn to do that. So for now, it's for fun. If you want to, raise the stakes with your friends and have a little pool between you, that's your own business. I totally encourage it, but not having a part in it myself, because I don't want to run afoul of Idaho's gaming laws or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't blame you at all for that. Well, Evan, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about Ultra GM. I know that me personally, I'm looking forward to playing Ultra GM this year. Looking forward to, like I said, the rooting interest across the different games that we're going to watch this year. In addition to the Miami Dolphins games, looking at how my team's going to compare to Chris Greer. So appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
To the listeners, leave a comment below. We'll try to respond to them. If you have any questions, like Evan said, send him an email, leave a comment below. And as always, we'll talk again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Eric.